Hello, folks. This is the second broadcast of Campaigniacs, brought to you by Post Media during this election campaign. We're now available on Google Podcasts. And with me today on this second podcast is a very special guest, an old friend of mine. We go back way longer than either one of us want to admit right now, covering politics. Stefani Langenegger. Did I ever pronounce that right? Have I ever pronounced it?
You pronounced it right just now.
Just for the first time.
Thanks, old man.
Good to see you, old buddy. Thank you so much for doing this. And of course, also with me is Arthur White-Crummy, who has been with us on these podcasts since the beginning, which was just last week, and of course is covering the legislature for the Leader Post and Star Phoenix, and is covering this election. So I guess that's where we're going to start, Arthur. Tell me about the week, and tell me about the influence of federal politics in this campaign already, because I find it fascinating. Almost every election since the beginning of time that Stefani and I have covered has had some element of federal politics in it. What are the developments this week as it relates to the court case, and how do you see that playing out a bit in terms of campaign strategy already?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of interesting that we seem to have come back to that default mode after what almost appeared to be an extended truce, where there were very little attempts to throw around the name Justin Trudeau as an insult until just the last few weeks. And we've again seen some of the Saskatchewan party advertising attacking Ryan Miley as in league with Justin Trudeau. And this is all coming as some of these long-running federal provincial disputes come back to the fore. So of course, as you said, Murray, we now have the carbon tax reference case before the Supreme Court. We've had the Premier send a letter to Justin Trudeau, again calling for a pause of the carbon tax and asking for an assurance that the Prime Minister's green agenda expected today in the federal throne speech is not going to be, quote, code for shutting down our oil and gas industry. So really, I think that we're starting to get a preview of what we're going to see during the campaign, where the classic strategy of running against Ottawa as much as running against your opponents is going to be very present once again.
Is it part of the timing now that we're past pandemic critical and into the meat and potatoes issues of federal provincial relations politics? It was really hard, I think, or harder for the Sask party government to take a run at Trudeau when he was incredibly popular in the early days dealing with the pandemic. But after the WE scandal and everything else, maybe it's a lot easier, and maybe there's more mileage actually for the Sask party than there might have been normally.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that when the economy was what was in extremely serious jeopardy and 73,000 jobs had been lost, and so many people were dependent on federal support, either through the wage subsidies or through CERB, people maybe appreciated the role of the federal government a little bit more, and the province had a really strong impetus to work collaboratively in order to secure some of those dollars. But now that now that the campaign is amping up, and now that the pandemic is becoming kind of background noise, I think that we're starting to see again a return to normal.
Steph, I think maybe some people forget about you is that you've been in Saskatchewan for most of your life, except for your period growing up in BC briefly, and you know this province inside out. You're running a radio program that's right now, I think, the most popular morning show in this province right now.
Yeah, it's the number one show in Regina. Yes.
They're like, this province. Why does this keep working? Why do people not see through it after a while? And I'm not suggesting it's right or wrong. I'm suggesting it just is politics. And when it comes to politics, people usually are pretty cynical and say, I don't know if I like this. But I think when it comes to the federal provincial fight, there's still an appetite for it. And I honestly don't get that.
Well, you know what? I think maybe it stems back. We moved here in 1980, and there was a huge push, as you know, in the subsequent years to oust the NDP and bring in a new regime with Grant Devine and the federal government. But even and definitely when we moved here, my dad, I've said many times, was conservative and definitely was a part of the wave of rural people who were excited about Grant Devine getting elected. But I think he and people who are New Democrats in Saskatchewan, farmers, I mean, what they had in common was the fact that Ottawa has never seemed to fully understood Western Canada or the reality of farming in Western Canada, which, as you know, is different than, say, the Lyle Van Cleef School of Farming in Ontario. Yep. We have different farms here, and we have a different reality here. And I mean, my dad still remembers the Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. literally giving us the finger and still talks about the national energy policy. And I think on that front, he might have something in common with people who don't support the same provincial political parties as he does. So I think it works in some respects because we do feel a bit misunderstood here in Western Canada by Ottawa, and that to campaign on nobody really understands us there the way we understand ourselves has just always worked wherever you are on the spectrum.
I've always been curious why Conservatives are able now to capitalize on it, on this sentiment way more effectively than New Democrats are. And I look at it from the sentiment that you described 20, 30, 40 years ago when we were in the middle of the national energy policy and other issues, constitutional issues, that where New Democrats were actually at the forefront because they were running into government at the time. I guess perspective is almost twofold. This NDP is no longer your father's or anybody's NDP. They seem disorganized. They don't seem to have focus. They don't seem to connect. What is it especially about this factor in relation to federal politics and just generally things that you've seen evolve where they just don't connect anymore in the way that obviously they did when you and I were covering this place several years ago, and there was actually an NDP government that was relatively popular and kept winning elections 4 in a row.
Yeah, and held rural seats, as you know. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, Murray. I think definitely one thing that the NDP has not done since there was an NDP government is keep a leader. So, yeah. I mean, even if you imagine that, you know, Roy Romano was kind of apprenticing, if you will, under Alan Blakeney, he was definitely a known quantity by the time he became the premier. And we've had a series of premiers, as you well know, who've not had electoral success, then been eaten by their own and ousted. Pretty cynical move to bring back Dwayne Lingenfelter as a leader. Same thing for him, and then again for Cam Broten, and now we're at Ryan Miley, third leader in 3 elections that we've had now for the opposition. It's just, if you think that right now federally, Aaron O'Toole is still on a Hi, I'm Aaron O'Toole tour across Canada to really get known to his conservative base, well, what chance has the NDP in Saskatchewan to really have anyone who is known to voters, what they really stand for, particularly when in those leadership fights, they've had to argue with one another about what their policy ought to be. And then I think the other thing that you and I have noticed covering the Saskatchewan NDP in the legislature, which is different than how the party operates at its grassroots level, we've seen it fairly afraid, at least for a while, to take many risks. You'll remember that, for instance, when Cam Broten, I've got a dog who really wants to say something about this. When Cam Broten wanted to talk about the coal industry in Estevan and about whether carbon capture and all of that was worth the expense, but also didn't want to lose any votes from unionized coal workers. Well, you can't always have things both ways, or it makes you look like you don't really stand for anything. So I think it might be a combination of waffling policy and no continuity of leadership there, combined with what that would do to the internal morale of a party to be constantly battling leadership races.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and superior dog handling at the same time, which I don't know how you juggle both. Actually, you have one point that I want to that I think is particularly relevant to a couple of stories Arthur has been working about Walsh Acres, and that is the NDP not getting their own act together, whether it's on a policy-wise or just generally respecting and understanding the direction of leader and actually figuring out that maybe 3 weeks before election isn't the best time to get in an ugly fight over who's running a constituency and who's not, and whether a candidate should run or not. How difficult is this going to be in terms of Sandra Morin losing her candidacy in Walsh Acres a month ago, and now, according to your story in today's paper, Arthur, having even more trouble that we see the resignation or the removal, I guess, of the party president? Is this too inside politics, or do people generally see this as a big NDP problem where Ryan Miley isn't going to be seen as effectively running anything, and if he can't run, I guess, his own party, he can't run the province? Is this already becoming a factor in that sense, Arthur, do you think? Or?
I mean, it's hard to tell how much this is going to ripple outside of Regina Walsh Acres. Clearly, it does affect the perception of the NDP and the competence of their organization and the way that that's viewed. But even within Regina Walsh Acres, I mean, that is really a seat that they cannot afford to lose. I mean, if they're to have any chance at expanding, it's going to be in seats like Regina Walsh Acres. And given that they don't even have a candidate now 5 weeks before the election, and that the local membership appears to be completely divided and to a large extent unsupportive of the leader's decision-making in that case, I think that that's going to make it extremely difficult for them to take that seat. The Sask party has been at work for months on it. But clearly, there's a lot of mystery here about exactly what happened. And I think that everybody is going to read into the situation differently. What I find to be really interesting is that the two women who have now been ousted, Sandra Morin from her candidacy and Barb Diddy from the presidency of the Constituency Association, they're framing this as bullying. Sandra Morin has even suggested that there's an extent of a sexist element to it. I, of course, can't comment on to what extent that's true, but this is clearly something that the NDP cannot afford to continue to have as a prominent story as they're gearing up for a campaign.
Well, this is fascinating to me, because who would have thought the first political leader in this campaign to be facing sexism charges would be Ryan Miley, given that this is not the NDP brand. This is not certainly Ryan Miley's brand, but I think it is an issue out there. And you talk about it. We're going to get into it in the second segment of this podcast, where you've done interviews related to the difficulties of women candidates and having more women representation in the Saskatchewan legislature. What did you find out in that piece in broad strokes? Could you just, before we get into that second segment, talk about a little, Arthur, in terms of what we're looking at?
In terms of what I learned from Danielle Chartier and from the chair of Equal Voice here in Saskatchewan. Yeah, I mean, they obviously spoke about some of the well-known challenges of recruiting women to political parties and the barriers that women face in the nomination process. And again, we're seeing that again this election. The Saskatchewan Party only has 11 of its 61 candidates who are women. And we just basically talked about like why that continues to be the case in 2020. And we delved into Danielle Chartier's personal career to see what kind of light it sheds on the double standards and differential expectations that women face as they try to juggle politics and personal life.
It just so happens we have with us perhaps one of the best persons or most qualified persons to talk about this. You're probably going to be embarrassed for me to say this, but Stefani, folks, is absolutely a forerunner in terms of women's coverage in politics. I've worked with other women before Stefani, and I've worked with other women after. But what you have done in terms of ledge coverage is historic, dynamic. It's amazing. But so I guess I'm going to ask you a question from the other end of the spectrum. Is what barriers or what difficulties did you think you encountered as a female reporter at the legislature that maybe I just didn't recognize in my time there, because as a guy you wouldn't,
Well, I think fewer than female politicians face, to be honest with you. Just to Arthur's point, I've certainly done interviews over the years about why there's still a dearth of women running for office, even though we see women's representation in other fields, think of medicine, that have done much better over the years, that were also at one time disproportionately male-centered. And I think journalism moved quicker than politics also. So I think
that's interesting.
Like doctors that have become dominated, more graduates from medical school now are women, more graduates from journalism schools now are women as well. And sorry, guys, it'll probably drive your pay down because we make so much right now. But I think that's made it a little bit easier for me than if I had been in politics itself, because there were more of me at the time, but fewer when I started some 25 years or more ago. And I think what that meant for me, Murray, that it may not have meant for you, is that it was just more unusual to see me or women covering politics, covering political conventions. You'll remember when we started, we used to get a lot of tips in the bar. You would drink with MLAs in a way that I'm not sure anyone does anymore. There was a working of sources and a socializing that went on. And when you're one of a few women doing that job, sometimes people are surprised to see you there. They were used to a lot of men in politics being covered by a lot of men in the press gallery. And so when there are only one or two of you in a scrum, sometimes just well-meaning dumb things. Like I remember someone saying to a colleague of ours who was petite, "Oh, why don't we let the littlest one ask the first question?" They said to her in a scrum. Not being mean.
Yeah.
I got a long time ago.
And then I think you'll know, even just from Dr. Bonnie Henry in BC, their version of our Dr. Saqib Shahab in the news this week, talking about death threats and all kinds of personal name calling that she's been subject to. I'm not saying Dr. Shahab probably hasn't had his share of detractors also. I don't know if it's escalated to death threats and name calling, but you can look around to other prominent women and see that often the attacks that they get are not about their work. It's about how they look, or really sexist epithets where you're calling women names that are highly sexualized, or even threatening sexual assault or rape to punish women for speaking out too much. I mean, that's at an extreme. Certainly I didn't get that kind of treatment. I would say the most infuriating thing for me as a woman covering politics was the number of times I was seen talking to a man, either another journalist or a politician, privately to try and work on a story to get a scoop, and there'd be a rumor that I was having an affair with someone, which is not just ridiculous in terms of what it would require for me to do my job, and probably something, Murray, that you weren't as subject to, but really an infuriating assumption, which frankly fictionalized journalists don't do a lot to help, where you see women fictitious journalists sleeping with sources for stories and whatnot. But that was probably the most disappointing thing that I heard about, that I thought was a shame, because most certainly I didn't do that. I was working really hard to get the stories that I broke.
I remember that. It just so crapped me off at the time. And because we're doing this visually, there's probably another reason why I didn't have too many rumors about me sleeping with. Take a look, for God's sake. But all that, I did notice a big change between the 80s and the 90s when the NDP came into power, and we saw a lot more women in prominent roles. great respect for people like Pat Smith and Joan Duncan, who were the first Saskatchewan cabinet ministers that were women. And that was followed up by a whole series of Janice McKinnons and Louise Samards that really changed things in terms of women in politics. But as Arthur's piece suggests, it's still amazing to me that they have so far to go in this area. We're finally seeing an opposition where it's about 50-50. But if you look at women candidates right now, what is it right now, Arthur? Are we looking 50-50 at the NDP side?
I've broken it down by party, and it varies radically from one to the other. And the NDP is approaching 50-50. Last time I checked, they were about just over 20 women out of about 45. Whereas the Sask Party, as I said, was 11 out of 61. Green Party also aiming for 50-50. PC's not. We know nothing about the Liberals because it appears that they're not really nominating candidates.
Exactly.
So
this is actually bad. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, depending on how things go, given that the Sask Party is running a male candidate to replace Nancy Hepner, who is retiring north of Saskatoon there, and that we could actually see fewer women in the ledge in the coming legislature than we have in the previous.
That's fascinating. I could go on this subject all day, but we're going to move forward to the second segment of your podcast with this. Stephanie, thank you so much. This was truly fun, and I hope people got as much out of this as I did. Arthur, we'll see you on the campaign trail, and I think by this time next week we'll have an election.
I think
Thanks,
that's
guys.
a safe bet.
Yeah. Take care, guys. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Campaigniacs. This week, we're going to be looking at how to get more women engaged in politics. And I'm here with Danielle Chartier and also Lindsay Brumwell. So I was ask both of you to introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about what you do.
Do you want me to go?
Danielle first.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Chartier. I am the MLA for Saskatoon Riversdale and soon to be the retired MLA from Saskatoon Riversdale. I am not quite sure what I'm doing at this next phase of my life, but I'm wrapping up 11 years serving the community that's been my home for most of my life and looking forward to a change of pace. Just, if you want a little bit more information about me, I'm a mom of two. I've got a 22-year-old who is heading off to the United Kingdom here this week to do a master's, and I've got a 12-year-old who was one when I was elected and is really looking forward to having her mom around in the spring and fall when the legislature is usually sitting.
And now we'll go to Lindsay.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Lindsay Brumwell. I'm the chair for Equal Voice, the Saskatchewan chapter. In my daytime life, I work in public affairs in the transportation industry, and I volunteer for Equal Voice, and it's an organization that focuses on trying to get parity in all levels of government across Canada, as well as in each province. And we provide training, networking, programming, and support mechanisms to try and bring more women into local politics.
So as we dive into the conversation here, I want to start by asking Lindsay, because your information, you have a lot of the numbers about how Saskatchewan is actually doing on this in terms of getting women engaged in kind of provincial politics on the legislative level. So can you tell me what we know about how far we may have come and how we compare to other provinces?
So all progress is sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Saskatchewan has a long history. I think everyone's aware that women in our agricultural communities were some of the forefront in the suffragette movement here in the history of the province. So that's something we should be really proud of, and a deep connection to our farming community. And then things have ebbed and flowed over the years. I can tell you that actually the first female mayor in the entire province was in Moose Jaw, not far from Regina. And today we have only 15 of the 61 MLAs in the province of Saskatchewan are women. And while Danielle is not running, we're always looking for more female candidates or women candidates to step forward. And I can tell you we are not at the very bottom in Canada in terms of women representation in our provincial legislature, but we're definitely not near the top. And if you compare us at all with some of our trading countries, it's a bit all over the place. We're probably in the bottom quartile.
And it's looking to me, based on my own research, that this election isn't looking like it's going to change things. We're not seeing a slate that's looking anywhere near balanced. If you take all the parties together, if you look at them one by one, we have the Saskatchewan party so far nominating 11 women out of 60 that they fielded so far. The NDP pretty close to 50%. The PCs 5 of 26 so far, and the Greens saying that they're aiming for 50-50. So depending on how things go, we might even see fewer women in the legislature after this coming campaign than we saw in the last one. I'll start with Danielle. What is your reaction to that?
It's disappointing for sure. I can tell you, as a woman who's been serving in the legislature for 11 years, I've been part of a caucus where there's been few of us, and I was really proud in 2016 to be a member of the caucus where we reached gender parity. We were half and half, and it's like close to half and half now, but we won a by-election where we ran a male candidate, so it's it's 6 and 7 right now. But I can tell you from my experience, and it's not that my male colleagues aren't awesome, but I can tell you the nature of the conversations that we've had around the caucus table, the kinds of topics that we choose to bring up as an opposition, I think has really changed because of the balance around our caucus. It's just, the reality is when you have multiple voices, it makes room for multiple perspectives, and we, instead of getting caught up into a groupthink or not thinking about things that aren't part of your lived reality, the more voices you have, the more likely you're going to be more representative of the people that we serve. And I know, for example, since 2016, we have my colleague Nicole Sarr, who was diligent and passionate about making sure that we had not only job protected leave for women who were fleeing domestic abuse, but she got that part passed and convinced the government to come on board. But another part of that was getting paid days. So those are conversations that happen at a caucus level, but get really pushed when you've got support around that table to make that happen. So that's just one example. I can give you others, but speaking from experience, it changes the tone around the table, but it also changes what comes forward.
Yeah, and I think that is actually something that we should focus on a bit more, Lindsay. Just what does having a more balanced legislature with more diversity of voices do for politics and do for the kinds of kind of representation that Saskatchewan people actually get out of their legislative assembly?
Well, absolutely. Just over 50% of the Saskatchewan population identifies as women or other, and that basically means, at a minimum, trying to get a balanced elected office. Democracy is supposed to represent people, so a bare bones minimum standard would be focusing on trying to get, there's 50+% of the women and other are in that category. Having representation that represents that minimum standard would be a great first step to opening doors for further diversity. That doesn't mean people shouldn't, of other diversities or identification, shouldn't still run. In fact, please do. However, it's a nice starting point.
So then what's actually, getting in the way? Because I don't doubt that there's a very large number of talented women that could no doubt make a difference in politics. what's getting in the way of them actually making their way through the system, getting nominated, winning elections? Where are the filters operating in your experience? We'll start with Danielle.
Well, I think when women are nominated, we don't have any trouble winning elections. I don't think that is the case. I firmly believe, and I believe evidence shows it, it's really around political parties and the nomination process. And also women not necessarily seeing themselves in politics. You've got women living in, you've got women leading in every sphere across our province, in their communities, in their workplaces, urban and rural. We have amazing leaders, but sometimes A, they haven't been asked, B, they haven't been asked multiple times, and sometimes that's what it takes, because you need to see yourself reflected. And honestly, we're maybe doing a little bit better, but when we think of politicians, we're not always thinking about the woman with a child at home. Like that is not the standard practice here still, even though that is the world in which we all live. So the issue around leadership around parties, I can tell you how we've gotten there as New Democrats. And make no mistake, this didn't happen by chance. We've been working on it for years. I was part of the New Democratic Women in 2007 when we brought forward a motion and had a full learning day at one of our conventions about why electing more women matters. We got leadership on board, and in the election campaign, in the leadership campaign in 2013, I believe it was, I'm right about that date, we had leaders, both Ryan Miley and Cam and Trent were all committed to more diverse legislatures. That was part of their policy, and they've carried forward that. We've gotten to where we are because we've had leadership at the party level, in our caucus, making sure that we're tapping women on the shoulder, following up with them. It was interesting, in your article on Friday, there was a reference to quotas. We don't have quotas in the NDP. We have a system by which we make sure that we don't have our blinders on in a nomination, that everybody who should be in the race is in the race. And so I get a little prickly when someone says that we have quotas. That's not it at all. It's about making sure that we are identifying and supporting people to try to be successful in nominations. It has taken leadership. Other places that have achieved a higher level of diversity, it really has, it's got to be leadership across the political party.
And what are you finding, Lindsay? Is this more a problem of getting women into the process at the beginning before nominations begin? Or are we seeing that women who have already gotten involved and thrown their hats into the ring are being filtered out during the nomination process or during the general election? Where are the barriers here?
So it's a bit of a multifaceted approach because there's so many barriers. So one of the big things is, if you're looking at party politics, which is the provincial or federal level, we would recommend women start getting involved with their parties earlier. Like, for example, if you're thinking about running for provincial MLA, start getting involved with the party that you align with most closely today for the next election, not this one, but the next one. And we would highly recommend volunteering on someone's campaign right now to learn more about what campaigning is, what a candidate goes through, what the roles are, how to build your team, those tactical things and knowledge that women tend not to be as familiar with, and kind of demystify that process. The other reason is to learn about your internal party's process for nomination. What is it going to take to seek the nomination, and how to go about that? Also, how to identify people within the party who could support you on a campaign and help you with your nomination. The hardest campaign will be the nomination process. A lot of women don't jump to provincial first off. They're going to start with something a little bit closer to home and issues that they're passionate about. So think about asking women to run for school board or councillor or the RM or resort towns and those kinds of things. And the first step really is for society as a whole to start looking at women as potential leaders. Everyone knows a woman that's a leader. Everybody does. It's your mom or the lady who runs the community centers or the different things. They take leadership roles. Now, how do we translate that into getting them onto a ballot? And the first step is to ask them. Like, it's up to each of us to ask a woman to run. And Danielle's comment about, women needing to be asked more than once. Statistically, a woman needs to be asked 5 times before they start thinking about it. Because they'll start running through like, okay, I have this family obligation. What about my career? Do I have enough money? What is this going to do to my reputation? Is my husband going to be okay with it? Or my partner? What are my parents going to think? And it just trickles through. Where there was a great event with Christy Clark, and her comment was, men are flattered. Oh, you think I can run? Absolutely. And it's a completely different approach to it.
Yeah.
So one, I would say women need to think of themselves and recognize their leadership skills. They do have a lot more experience than they give themselves credit for. And second of all, when you see those women in your community, prod them in the right direction and ask them to run. And then tell them where you think they would be good at, where they can contribute. Because it's one thing to be asked, but then it's like, well, do you mean provincial or do you mean for school board? Like, give them, I think you'd be a really good MP, or I think you'd be a really good Reeve, and we need you to run because we want you to do the X. And you're passionate about that, and really can start at a grassroots level. And I'm just going to put a little plug in here. At Equal Voice, we recognize across the province, there is a lot of organizations focused on women leadership. And we're really trying to focus our programming on those tactical things to demystify so that women can figure out how to run a campaign for a nomination. And we open it up not just to women, but to their entire team. We were actually encouraging people in our last campaign training to bring their teenagers, their moms, dads, to come to our campaign training, because anyone can put up a lawn sign and you're going to need that support network. So it's best to get them educated and trained up around you to give you the best shot through getting that through that nomination process. The other thing is parties can definitely step forward with trying to tap women that they see and encouraging them and just kind of gently opening those doors. And it's always good to have a champion. So within those party systems, if there's men or women, look around, see who the up and comers are and be their champion. There's mentorship programs, do it in politics too.
I just want to actually jump in and ask if we can explore some of these issues a bit more through your career, Danielle. How did you first get your start in politics, and how did you navigate some of these barriers that we've been discussing?
Well, I think fortunately for me, I grew up in a really political household. My parents were both active New Democrats in Riversdale, but they were also community activists. And I grew up in a household where there's 7 kids. Not all of us are New Democrats, but my parents made it very clear that political parties reflect values. You need to know what your values are, and then you choose the political party that best reflects who you are. And if there's things you disagree, it's your obligation to get involved and make those differences. So I grew up going to political events, but I wasn't the amazing 18-year-old who is the activist doing her work. I worked at Louis. I probably spent more time at Louis at the campus pub when I was 19 or 20, and my activist spark really started when my oldest daughter was born when I was 27. It was like a light went on, and I very much about supporting women and families, whether it's childcare. I was a breastfeeding advocate about making sure women and families had good support there. The Children's Discovery Museum was something I was very involved in. But so my activist spark really was lit not until I had my own child. And at that point, it's not like I wasn't interested in politics, but Hennessy was born and I got involved in partisan politics and sat on the Riversdale executive. And I had been comfortable with all of that growing up, though that wasn't unfamiliar. And I can remember when Lauren Calvert, it's always an MLA's responsibility to think about the future and to try to do succession planning. So Mr. Calvert had talked to several people, but he'd asked me at one point when Ophelia was only 6 months old if I was interested in running at some point because he wouldn't be the MLA anymore. And my initial reaction was, oh yeah, like somewhere down the future. And then he called me 6 months later and I almost hung up the phone. A moment of panic because Ophelia was so little and I wanted to do it. I feel super passionate. At that point, work family issues were my thing, but I can remember coming home and saying to my then husband, Lauren's stepping down and wants me to run, but I can't do it because Ophelia is one. And my then husband said, well, if you don't do it, I'm going to. And I'm like, well, it's the same 1-year-old that we share. Like, I don't quite get how it's something that you see. And so I embarked upon it a little bit reluctantly at first, but I was fortunate to have a huge family network of support. I lived 2 blocks away from my mom and dad. My sister has no children and is like super mom. We call her mommy auntie. She's been amazing for my kids, but that's how it happened for me. I was interested in politics, but not super engaged, kind of did my own thing, and then found the thing that set my heart on fire, and that compelled me into politics, and someone saw that I maybe had some qualities that would make me a good MLA. And that someone was very influential and made me feel like I could do it. So,
did you feel that you faced different expectations about family life than some of your male colleagues within caucus and within the legislature?
I think early on, 100%. I mean, I had people on the doorstep asking me who was going to look after my children. In the same campaign, the male candidate for the other party had a child younger than mine at that point, but I was having people ask me about my kids and who would care for them. It's been much better. I have male colleagues who have had children in recent years, and that certainly has made me really pleased. I can remember Ryan is great and brings his kids everywhere, but I can remember with Cam, calling Cam on a Friday morning, and he was the leader of our party, and he was home with his kids on a Friday morning because his wife was at her job, and it was felt incredibly supportive at that point. But certainly I think that there's probably moments where I've held myself up to a standard that other people aren't necessarily thinking. I know I'm a single mom and have been for 9 of my 11 years as an MLA, and my youngest was super clingy. She's amazing, but it was awfully fond of her mom and liked to come up to the podium, liked to hold on to my leg. There were lots of times where I felt like I was neither the best MLA nor the best mother. But I always got the job done. It never looked pretty, but it's still the work still got done. But I do feel like for part of my career, it has, the childcare piece or being a parent has been a challenge, and it's been so great. I've got, as you know, Nicole Sarr had a baby, the first time that's happened in a long time here in the legislature, and we've all been super supportive on both sides of the house of that. And I would argue that I think in the 11 years that I've been here, I hear my colleagues on both sides of the house who have children actually get up and talk about their kids more than 11 years ago when I was first elected. So
now, of course, just to round out this talk, Danielle, the other side of this coin is, of course, how to retain women in politics. And of course, you are not running again. So I just wanted to ask whether there's anything that could have been done differently to keep you around longer, and why you're choosing to leave.
Well, I'm choosing to leave because it's been a tough 4+ years. My dad in the last election campaign broke his hip a week into it. So I'm that sandwich generation. I had parents in their 80s. My mom is still here and is 88, but I have young children too, and it has been a hard slog. between trying to make sure my dad was okay and making sure that my kids were okay. So it was interesting because when I told Trent Weatherspoon, actually, who has been incredibly supportive all along. I've got great colleagues, but Trent, this is going to make me cry. So when I told my caucus I couldn't run, and Trent's like, Danielle, we need you. What can we do to support you? Can we, you don't have to be here every day during session. What can we do to make sure you can run and keep doing this job? How can we be of help? So I think those are questions that we have to ask. What can we do to keep supporting people who have care responsibilities to do this job, because those voices are really important. Women aren't a homogenous group, and we certainly need more women who don't just look like me. I'm awfully white. We need a lot more diversity in this place, but constantly asking those questions about how do we make sure that this is a place where people can come and serve their fellow citizens. I mean, there's been stuff along my legislative career as a woman. I mean, I've had, like I said, people asking me who was going to take care of my kids. I've had people comment about my somewhat unruly curly hair. I've had people comment about my jewelry. I've had a Sask Party MLA tell me my skirt was too short, a female MLA. I've had, as a committee chair, I've had a male colleague during a recess and pat his lap and invite me to sit on his lap. There's lousy things that still happen in this this century, in these last few years. But I really would argue that the big piece is making sure people can balance their work and family. And we're not just talking about kids, we're talking about elders as well. But I think the other piece for me, I'm a bit of a interloper on social media. I go and I peek, and I don't always post because I would need to spend an hour posting. I'm not very good at the one-off, and so I am a bit of an interloper. But I would say that the vitriol of social media probably keeps some people out too. I would argue that the biggest piece is work and family challenges for sure, but and I never would have said it was that political environment. I mean, I'm a pretty tough, I've got pretty thick skin. My skin is considerably thicker than it once was, but I would say that social media has not been particularly kind to lots of women. I mean, I don't count myself in that. I've been pretty lucky, but I think thinking about how we navigate that world and make it a bit less harsh would be, I'm not harsh, not that women aren't capable of dealing with garbage, but unfortunately, or tough debates, but it's hard to deal with garbage comments.
Right. It seems like some of the personal stuff does seem to come towards women a bit more often, and is often a lot more toxic. We only have to think of Catherine McKenna to see an example of that. Well, thanks to both of you for being on the podcast today, and thanks to all of our readers and all of our listeners for being on Campaigniacs once again. And we'll see you next week.